Hello and welcome back to StoryTime with Eric Zimmer. Where we last left off in the Mighty Dozen, the team has finally encountered James. What follows is a battle like no one has ever seen or heard before. I've got a bad feeling about this. Let's see what happens. So you ready? Alright, let's begin. This is another really long chapter, too. The Mighty Nine stood transfixed as they saw their leader, James, stand there, staring down at them like a raging Hulk monster. With a roar of rage, James lifted his right arm, as thick as a tree trunk, directly above his head. Nearby, Eddie, Peter, and Clara, in pursuit of James themselves, heard James's roar. They turned in the direction of where the sound was coming from and gasped. Back where the team was, James had raised his arm high above his head and started to bring it down. Carly let out a blood-curdling shriek of terror and tried to run, but James's hand clipped her and knocked her clean off her feet. She went hurtling into Richard, Christy, and Frank. This snapped them and the rest of the team out of their frozen terror. The others screamed and started to run in all directions. James attempted to swipe them as well, but this time he missed, although his fist smashing into the ground created so much force that the impact caused everybody to fall down. James laughed evilly though it sounded more like roaring as the team looked up at him, absolutely horrified. His laugh even louder, sounding worse than a mad scientist. "You poor, insignificant little bastards! Look out!" Richard screamed, pointing. James raised his arm once more, this time aiming for Christy, but Richard sped towards her and pushed her out of the way, barely escaping the swipe of James's hand himself. Carly stood in front of Richard and Christy, shielding them from James as he came towards them. "Jimmy, stop!" she cried, trying not to panic. "We just want to help. If you don't surrender, General Henderson and his army are gonna murder you." "Bullshit, Pink Lady," scoffed James. "I'm impervious to their weapons. Let them try to stop me now." "Pink Lady?" Carly was shocked. "Jimmy, it's me." James got down on all fours and roared angrily and loudly. Carly screamed in terror, as did Richard and Christy, for James's angry face in this form was too scary to describe in words. Richard grabbed Christy and hid behind some boulders nearby, while Carly took to the sky, hovering right over James's head. Frank, Gary, and Joey tried to flee as well, but James swatted the three of them, knocking them over and sending them flying several yards before they all hit the ground hard. Fortunately, they were unharmed as Carly examined when she floated over to them. "Jimmy looks really angry, Carly," said Joey, shaking with fright. "You think?" Frank shouted irritably. "Maybe he'd calm down a little bit if you tried being nicer to him," said Joey, ignoring Frank entirely. Just then, Pedro and Reginald went hurtling towards them. Frank and Gary managed to stop them from crashing into anything. James roared again. "There's no time for that, Joseph," cried Carly, now getting hysterical. "Mighty Nine, attack!" "You've all mocked me for the last time. Let's see how you assholes like being mocked," James roared angrily. Very reluctantly, everybody gathered around James, ready to battle with him, or at least subdue him. He, however, grinned evilly at them because he knew perfectly well they couldn't beat him. If they couldn't take him down single-handedly at his normal size, what made them think they could take him down as a Hulk monster? Besides, to James at least, this was the perfect opportunity for him to show off his superpowers. Though scared beyond belief, Richard ran up to James and started punching him rapid fire in the leg. James, unfazed by the attack, simply lowered his hand and reached out to grab Richard. "Richard, look out!" Christy cried. Too late, James clamped his hand around Richard tightly and brought him close to his gigantic, scary face. "Shame the rest of your muscles aren't as fast as your mouth, speed demon!" He threw Richard as Christy screamed, But when it looked like Richard was going to crash, Frank quickly stepped in and waved his hands. Using his magnetic powers, Frank got a hold of Richard and slowed him down, ensuring that he landed safely on his feet. "That was so cool," Richard exclaimed ecstatically. "Can we do that again, Frankie?" Before Frank could answer, James came storming up to him. Frank cowered, allowing James to snatch him up and bring him close to his face. "No matter out here to use against me, magnet boy," mocked James. Frank screamed in terror as James threw him too, but Pedro, stretching himself, managed to catch Frank and bring him down safely. "Thanks, Pedro," said Frank. James stepped in front of them, seething with anger. "Or thanks a lot," said Frank, now terrified. "Come here, you little—" James grabbed a hold of Pedro and raised him above his head. Using both hands, James stretched Pedro out and started using him like a jump rope, laughing maniacally. "You've been spending way too much time on safaris, el estupido. Need I stretch the truth?" he roared mockingly. The others were completely appalled by his sight, but at the same time they knew they had to be careful to plan their next attack. One false move and James could stop on them to death, accident or not. Thinking fast, Carly used her super strength and flight to knock James over, causing him to let go of Pedro. As Pedro fell to the ground, he returned to his normal size as Reginald stood below and managed to grab him. James glared at them as he got back to his feet. "Is this enough trouble in the Highlands for you, laddie?" Reginald began making kung fu attacks around James's legs, but it did nothing whatsoever. James, looking unimpressed, finally raised his hand and effortlessly knocked Reginald off his feet with a flick of his giant finger. "You're a kung fu? Well, get ready for the chop!" Reginald felt like his throat was going dry. James intended to chop Reginald by landing on him with his shoulders, crushing him. However, as James prepared to attack, Reginald rolled quickly out of the way. And suddenly, James was invisible. The others were dumbfounded as they looked at Gary. "Gary, what gives?" cried Frank. "I was trying to make Reggie invisible," Gary panicked. "You made Jimmy invisible," Christy shrieked. "I'm aware of that, Christiana." Just then a roar was heard, and to their horror, they could see James getting to his feet, judging by the footprints he made by the shape of his body in the sand. "Hurry, Gary!" cried Joey. "I got it, dude," said Gary, frantically waving his hands. In a split second, James materialized out of thin air, fuming and coming straight towards Gary, who turned himself invisible and tried to run. However, James, grinning evilly, could see Gary's footprints appearing in the sand. With careful aim, James reached out a hand and snatched Gary, who became visible again as he stared at James with chattering teeth. James laughed out loud. "There's one downside to being invisible, you gyro-eating pretty boy. It doesn't stop you from being solid." "Jimmy, dude, please don't hurt me." Without a word, James raised his arm above his head and flung Gary through the air. Acting fast, Christy used her ice powers to create an icy slide in which Gary landed on and slid safely down to the ground. "Woohoo! Thanks, Dudette." Before Christy could say anything, James suddenly came up to her, laughing maniacally. Christy shielded her face with her hands, but in doing so, accidentally sent giant icicles into James's arm, where they stuck like pegs. He roared in pain so loudly that everybody had to cover their ears, especially Pedro, who had very good hearing, though his ears were sensitive to really loud noises. Nearby, Eddie, Peter, and Clara, following the trail of the Mighty Nine, heard James's roar. They skidded in the sand after running through the desert. "Jimmy's in trouble! Come on!" Eddie yelled. Filled with determination, the three kids began sprinting towards the direction of the sounds, hoping they wouldn't be too late. Meanwhile, Christy opened her eyes and saw James roaring in pain as he pulled the giant icicles out of his arm. She quickly realized her mistake and started shaking with fright. "James, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I'm so sorry." James roared in anger as he pulled the last icicle out of his arm and threw it aside. Luckily for him, there was no blood on his arm, for his skin was too thick to penetrate. "You'll pay for that! Time for you to chill out, Ice Queen!" Snatching up the giant icicles at his side, James quickly put them around Christie like a prison cell and put a giant flat rock on top of it so that she couldn't escape. Then he turned his attention to the others and tried to swat them. As he did so, Frank and Carly took this opportunity to free Christie. Carly used her super strength to lift the flat rock and throw it out of the way, while Frank used his magnet powers to lift the icicles and toss them aside. Richard sped over and carried Christie out of harm's way. She hugged him very tightly and was hyperventilating. Meanwhile, while that was happening, Reginald, Pedro, Gary, and Joey were luring James away from Christie for as long as possible. Remembering his super belch was also powerful enough to knock a person unconscious, Joey tried to use one on James. Before he could do so, however, James snatched him up. Joey was shocked, as were Reginald, Pedro, and Gary. James inhaled deeply and belched in Joey's face. His breath must have been very bad, especially with what he ate and all the cigars he smoked in the last 3 days and nights while putting together the antidote, because Joey caught a whiff of it and looked ready to vomit. James then threw Joey to the ground. Reginald, Pedro, and Gary caught him just in time. James then turned his attention to where Carly, Richard, and Frank were freeing Christie from her ice prison. They gasped in horror as he approached them, fuming with rage. He lunged at Carly and snatched her up while the other three scattered to the sides. As James held her close to his face, Carly shrieked at the sight of his twisted, angry, monstrous face and blazing red eyes. The hatred in James's face as he glared at Carly was immeasurable. "You're mine now, Pink Lady. You shall never insult me again. Do you hear me? Ever!" James started squeezing Carly in his hand in an obvious attempt to kill her. But using her super strength, she eventually managed to get out of his grip. Once free, Carly started flying around James, intending to knock him unconscious. But James, knowing what she was going to do next, simply swatted her again, sending her flying through the air. Seeing this, Frank used his magnetic powers to slow Carly down, so she could land safely. "Close one, Frankie." "Get back here, bitch!" James came storming up behind her, even more livid than ever. He was ready to kill. Everybody cowered, thinking they were done for. But Carly, remembering Joey's advice, took to the sky and hovered at James's eyelids.